Hi, I'm Genesis Belanger, and my day job was a prop stylist assistant.
Okay, so you were a prop stylist assistant, and prop styling is an important part of creating images for advertising, but it might not be something that most people know the sort of ins and outs of. So I was wondering if you could tell us what prop styling is exactly and what your work as a prop stylist assistant consisted of.
Sure, no problem. So, whenever you see an image in a magazine or on television, the aesthetics of the image are conceived of by the director or a producer in conjunction with a client. And the prop stylist's job is to flesh that out. So, they'll be told, we want an office to look like it's owned by a wealthy, successful businessman from 1960. And they'll probably be given some reference images. And then they'll go about constructing that reality down to every little detail that might possibly be visible in the image. And the assistant of a prop stylist does a lot of the schlepping labor. So hustling around the city, trying to track down various elements from thread and fabric to pieces of furniture, taking a lot of photographs of things that they see to bring back to then later go get. And yeah, basically anything else the prop stylist might need, like a traditional assistant job.
And how did you find yourself in this career?
It was word of mouth. My friends from college were assisting a prop stylist, and they needed an additional person. And I think that's kind of how it works. It's like it's a young person's job, not always, but largely. And they called me up, and it was just felt like such a great fit that I stayed on for several years.
Yeah. So you, at this point, you had finished your art school degree. And so you were figuring out how to live in the city.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Art school doesn't exactly equal a career. And when you're young and you don't have a lot of experience, there are not a lot of fulfilling creative jobs readily available. I think that's largely why, creative types might wait tables or bartend. And I felt like this was really lucky to find a job that was so creative, but you didn't necessarily need a lot of experience.
Were you actively making art at this point? I'm curious, what you were making at this time.
Yes. So one of the other cool things about working as a freelancer is that you don't have a committed, 9 to 5 everyday schedule. So I would have, months off. So chunks of time where I wasn't working, and then I would work on my own work. And at that time I was making egg tempera paint from scratch, and then making these sort of elaborate interior scenes with sleeping people.
Wow.
I'm not saying they were good. They were not good.
But wow, okay, you were painting. So you've really traveled around different mediums throughout your time working as an artist. Yeah.
For sure.
How did it feel working in advertising? Like to sort of be on the other side of the equation of material desire, learning how the sausage gets made, as it were.
Yeah, it was a lot of things. In some ways, it was sort of liberating to realize that these expectations of perfection that are presented are completely manufactured. So that was really cool. Like, one of the most eye-opening experiences was going into a home to take pictures for some sort of Architectural Digest type publication. It wasn't that specifically. And fully propping the house. So rearranging all the people's things and adding in more things, adding art, so that it became a completely constructed environment but then it was sort of presented as if they were just images of a person's home. So that was really fascinating and liberating because it was like, oh, it's fine if I never live up to these expectations. And then it was frightening slash fascinating to realize how good this industry is as at using beauty as a tool and as a weapon. You know, art sort of at various different times has like eschewed beauty. And in especially when you're in art school, it's like making something beautiful sort of indicates that you're making something trite or trivial and wasting your time. But advertising knows that that's not true, and that by making something beautiful, you can really create desire and therefore consumers.
Okay, that actually leads quite nicely into a question I had in terms of the work that you're making now, the sculptures of the sort of still lifes that you make out of beautiful porcelain and stoneware. And I mean, they look just very soft and supple, and like they still might be like pliable if you were to touch them. So, you know, they're not shiny, like they're actually matte usually. So they're not shiny like the pages of a magazine or like a slicked like oiled model's like arm. But the viewer is like nevertheless sort of drawn into these very like literally and figuratively smooth objects. So do you feel like you sort of picked up any tricks of the trade that factor now into your own strategies for like making these objects desirable?
I I do feel like I picked up some tricks of the trade, not necessarily in the way that I make the objects, but I think in the way that I utilize the space in an exhibition. You know, I think about a narrative, and then I think about an environment where that narrative could play out, and then I prop the environment.
With your own beautifully handmade consumer objects. Um, so what is the process for making these? I mean, they look effortless, but I'm guessing quite a bit of manual labor goes into making them.
Yeah, definitely. I I make everything from a flat sheet of clay. So I roll all of my clay out and let it get to various different degrees of dry, which sort of dictates the type of shape you can make. Because everything's hollow, you know, it needs to be able to support its own weight. And I don't use glaze, so I pigment each clay body. If it's a pastel, it's been pigmented, and if it's a neutral tone, it's probably just the color of the clay. And we also build all of the furniture pieces in my studio. I have two assistants. One is an upholstery assistant, and the other is a metal and wood assistant. So I think that that little team allows me to make things that really wouldn't be possible with just one person.
Thinking about some of these objects themselves, I'm interested in the way, like, at least what it feels like to me, that like photography or the frame of a photograph sort of haunts your sculpture. I don't know. It's at once the process of taking the photograph, which of course you were involved with as a prop stylist assistant, like thinking about what's in the frame, what's out of the frame. You know, maybe the set isn't a complete set because you know there's only going to be so much in the photograph. Um, but also in terms of all of your sort of blown up, scaled up objects and like segmented, disembodied body parts, it also feels like the final photograph where you end up with the bits and pieces. Is that something that you think about, or is that just me reading into things?
No, definitely. Absolutely. I think it's really fascinating when you see a wide shot of like a tabletop photographic studio, and there's like a boom arm holding, you know, like one branch of a tree, or, you know, just a bit of something, but in the photo it's believable and your mind expands past those parameters. So I'm often thinking like I can give these body parts like a hard edge as if they've been sliced off, and we could photograph them in a way where it looked like there was a whole body. And I do think about scale both in a photographic sense where the size of something closer in the frame can appear much larger than the things behind it, but also how we do that psychologically, where if things are upsetting to us or we really love them, they are larger than life. So like our emotions can shift the scale. So I think that scale shift has that duality.
Yeah, that's really smart because it's the way we sort of tend to perhaps pay attention to certain things more than others. You sort of replicate that, yeah, in the actual size of the objects. Yeah, like the way like the cigarettes and the pills get so big in your work.
Yeah. Like our habits dominate us, and what we use to cope also dominates us. So I often try to make them a little bigger than they would be.
That actually reminds me of a work that I was just looking at, Big Sleep, your very, very large brush. But instead of bristles, they're tiny little fingers. I'm just curious if like you wouldn't mind sort of walking us through that piece a little bit.
Sure, totally. I think I was thinking a lot about tools and how gendered tools are. And I wanted to make a very sensitive tool. So I often think about how a metaphor can be made into reality with sculpture. So, this metaphor of a very sensitive tool, you can literally make a tool with 50 fingers. So that's one of the things I was thinking about. And the brush sits on a stack of mattresses, like a Princess and the Pea type stack of mattresses, because sensitivity is this gendered quality that is positive for women. So this absolutely absurd tool is in this environment to prove how special of a woman she is.
In thinking about your work, I looked up the word objectification because I was curious, like, are there other meanings? Like, and so there is the sort of standard meaning of degrading someone to a status of an object, which I feel like you get literally in a lot of your work. But then there's this secondary meaning, the expression of something abstract in a concrete form. And I think that your work really brings those two meanings together, like really brilliantly on this feminist critique, especially. But I think in terms of the way that your work uh, makes like actual visible sort of forms that encapsulate some of these very nuanced critiques of like symbolically gendered spheres, like consumption in the home, and even just like the politics of representation in terms of like gendered, body parts and like women smiling. Like another one of my favorite works of yours are those lamps that there are two grinning lamps, but then there are fingers coming out of the lamp that are like pushing the edges of the mouths into a grin.
Well, I'm sure many, many women have been told to smile by a complete stranger.
I mean, as you said, most, if not all women or female identifying people have like had these feelings about normative gender expectations that are just suffused in the culture, but are especially propagated by the sort of popular consumption culture. But I imagine that as a prop stylist, that was perhaps exacerbated a bit when you were working in that field as an assistant.
Definitely. I mean, like I said before, this business is so spectacularly good at using beauty against us. I'm being hyperbolic, but I worked on a few bridal books, which are these catalogs that certain chain stores produce for brides to choose items for the registries. And the way each one of those objects is propped and presented to induce a desire to have like some absurd toaster that you absolutely do not need was, really crazy to witness.
Just like baked into the heteropatriarchy. Buy this thing, then you can be the perfect you.
Totally. And the way that makeup is photographed, it becomes so luscious and is often photographed with food. And if you actually do like a Google search of like makeup ads and food, you'll see just like absolute absurd images of like citrus fruit sliced like right next to women's lips. And it is really, I just keep saying it's absurd. I'm like, it's so absurd, but really seductive at the same time. And I don't know how it does it, but it sort of makes you not question the outcome.
Yes. That's what I was about to say. Like when you do like a Google search like that and you see just like the sheer amount of like the same sort of genre of image, it becomes very clear to you like, oh, I had just like assimilated this. Like it was just sort of like going in and like not really being thought about. But I feel like your use of consumer objects, like very familiar household things, makeup, whatever, food, like styled food, in your installations is doing the exact opposite. Like it's really making you slow down and think about those mechanisms.
Totally.
I was thinking about one way that it sort of does this is like with the finger bristles, and other works where you have, instead of chocolates in a candy box, you have eyes and an ear and a nose and a mouth. I mean, it's very uncanny. That borders on, depending on who you are, like disturbing or at least unsettling. Um, I'm curious, like, you're into certainly thinking about like psychological things, but are you also like interested in sort of psychoanalysis, or at least that sort of level of sort of object desire as a way, like in a more popular culture sense?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's really interesting and sort of funny how art picks up the discarded experts from other fields. And, like psychology doesn't necessarily want these like analysis, yeah, anymore. And they don't necessarily think it's relevant, but I think it still is really interesting to think about. And if there is something that makes us think about ourselves when we see something familiar, but at the same time, it's uncomfortable. It sort of requires that you like figure out why. And I think like any opportunity for self-reflection is positive and can lead to like an interesting conversation or something along those lines.
No, totally. So, in terms of when you're designing these objects, I mean, do you sketch? Do you like talk to your studio assistants? Like, obviously, you can't imagine what every viewer is going to, think upon seeing the work, but like, how do you sort of like think through some of those moves when you're thinking about making, whether it's an individual object or in the final sort of installation?
I definitely sketch. I usually draw every morning, and I don't really try. I just sort of like a few years ago, I decided that I would trust that I'm like an engaged human who's perpetually asking questions and reading things and thinking about the world, that I could sort of trust that that information would just be in the work. And I'll have like a broad idea that I'm working with, but I won't like hold on too tightly to the details. Um, I call it not touching the butterfly wings. So I don't touch the butterfly wings, and I just make a million drawings, and the narrative will start to unfold, and objects will I'll see relationships between one thing that I've drawn and another thing, and I sort of build all the installations from there. And I think that like the uncanny qualities are just present because I'm usually thinking about some sort of contradiction or something that's upsetting me about our culture.
Do you ever like sketch like right when you first wake up? Like do any of these things like come to you in dreams?
I never remember my dreams. I do sketch, like I drink coffee and sketch. That is like my practice. So, sometimes things come like fully actualized. Like I know exactly what I want to draw and it's not a meandering process. Other times it is. So maybe those come from some repressed place.
I mean, that these are the sorts of things, these images from advertising, that we don't really think that we're actively taking in, that then end up knocking around in there. So that's why it often does feel like this realm full of subconscious energy.
Yes, I could see that.
But part of that is too just like some of the sort of mid-century vintage feel of a lot of either the furniture that you're building or even just sort of like the hues too, like seem like from like old advertisements. And I'm wondering like how you think about those references, like nostalgia now, like even more so, it feels like there is like a dangerous edge to it. And so I'm sort of wondering where you feel like the work comes down on that. Is there a critique?
Totally. I like fully embrace nostalgia. I think that nostalgia is powerful the same way that beauty is powerful. And a great example of that is how Trump used nostalgia, like, let's make America great again. He was really asking people to think of this nebulous point in the past where America was great, and then imagine that it could be like that again. So, if politicians recognize that nostalgia is immensely powerful and advertisers recognize that beauty is immensely powerful, like, why does art think that these are two dirty words? And so I'm pro nostalgia.
I mean, it feels like in general, a lot of advertising is targeted towards women. And it feels like your sort of installations and still lifes also are thinking about, not that they're addressing women, but they're thinking about these like trends that are for women. Are there any in particular that you feel like you've been working through lately in your work?
I think I'm always dealing a little bit with the unrealistic beauty standards and the ageism. It's really intense how there are no representations of middle-aged women, but middle-aged women are the biggest consumers. So you have all the money to buy all the things, but nothing is being advertised for you or to you or using a representation of you. So I think that there's something in that obsession with youth that I perpetually am frustrated by, slash fascinated, slash repulsed.
Yeah, it feels like maybe some of your tender like baby hues kind of speak towards that.
Totally.
Everything's like a little like twee, like in a great way, but it's like in that way that things are sort of skewed towards the young woman always. I was thinking about some of the food sculptures that you've made lately that like, especially in their coloring, edge on the sort of like decay, like, oh, how long has this been sitting here like this? Is that another sort of area where you're thinking about sort of age, but in a different way?
Yeah, definitely. I think that food is often represented as a marker for like luscious, vivacious life. Especially with like I was speaking earlier about fruits and makeup going together. And sometimes men refer to women as like ripe fruit. It's like all of those metaphors that are used to reduce women that are basically could also be talking about food are gross and really interesting. So I do think about like, can I make a food that's formally beautiful but also repulsive?
Yes. Yes. I feel like that's a good way to capture like a lot of what's strange and estranging in your work is that it's all very aesthetically pleasing. And then like that, the food I was thinking about, you're looking at the table, you're like, oh, there's a severed foot that someone has already enjoyed on this table too. Okay. Thank you so much, Genesis. It's been so wonderful spending some time in your world.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure speaking with you.